The times they are a-changin', and so is the job market. But a century ago, your best bet for employment might not have been as far off from today as you might think. Before stenographers and typists, people took notes and dictation by hand. But with the invention of the typewriter in the mid-19th century, the job evolved, with larger businesses like insurance and railroad companies making the transition in earnest. And in place of the men originally hired to take dictation from their employers, the advent of the typewriter brought women into the job, not least because they could be hired at a lower rate of pay. In the early 20th century, as women were increasingly able to enter the workforce, the job of stenographer and/or typist became one of the most popular opportunities. In 1920, over 610,000 people listed their job as stenographer or typist, and a majority were women, although children were also sometimes employed in those positions. Curiously, because of this proliferation of women working as stenographers and typists, male stenographers began trying to distinguish between legal and business stenography.
Oh, miss.
Don't ever say that again.
Men claimed that courtroom stenography required physical and mental capabilities women lacked and could contain content that would shock women. There was little chance of promotion for the predominantly young women in these roles, as they were only expected to work for a brief time until they got married. A century ago, one of the most common jobs in the United States was working in the steel and iron industries, which had over 1.4 million employees as of the 1920 census. Before modern-day workplace standards, being a steelworker was very dangerous indeed. Not only were there no safety guards for machines or protective clothing for employees, it was also extremely hot, with the heat from the furnaces reaching over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hundreds were maimed or killed in steel plants every year from blast furnaces, electricity, and falling objects. Steelworkers would pour molten steel into molds. One worker, quoted by PBS, reported, "If there was water in the molds when they would tap it, the damn thing would explode and metal would fly all over the area." Many ended up partially deaf due to the immense noise at the steel factories. Immigrant workers for whom English was not their first language fared even worse. In the early 20th century, at places like the Southwark Steel Plant, immigrant workers were injured at a rate twice that of English-speaking workers. At the beginning of the 20th century, coal was widely used across the United States as a source of energy, with the majority being produced in Appalachia. The coal industry employed over 730,000 people around 1920. Coal was in constant demand. Steam engines ran on it, and bakers, manufacturers, and even common household heating and cooking depended on it, to name just a few. So coal miners were employed in massive numbers. In 1920s Appalachia, black people initially made up over a quarter of all coal mine workers, but not all by choice. Companies like Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad and United States Steel Corporation used convict labor, predominantly black, to operate their coal mines. Coal mining was dangerous, involving either going deep underground or using a pickaxe or shovel to scrape coal from the sides of mountains. Over 1,500 people were killed on average every year in coal mining accidents, like roof collapses and gas explosions. Another popular job a century ago was bookkeeping and accounting. And unlike other industries, this occupation has grown from a little under 750,000 workers in 1920 to over 1.7 million workers in 2020. Being a bookkeeper or an accountant initially involved doing data entry and calculations for one's employer. But as businesses and industries grew, they sought to attract investors and shareholders by showing their financial records, which led to the establishment of the certified public accountant role by the beginning of the 20th century.
I might remind you, the time is what I'm paying you for, at $17.50 a week. 54 hours a week, that's nearly 33 cents an hour.
Originally, the majority of workers in this occupation were men, with less than 800 women working as bookkeepers in the entire United States in 1870. But by 1930, there were over 465,000 women working as bookkeepers, comprising over 60% of the workforce. However, while women began to dominate the world of bookkeeping, the accountants were mainly men. And although women were allowed to study to become accountants, they weren't always permitted to take the CPA exam to become certified. In fact, by 1920, only around 11% of all accountants were women. But over the past 100 years, the demographics have shifted. As of 2023, over 61% of all accountants are women. At the beginning of the 20th century, up to half of the United States mandated at least some school attendance. The majority of these states were in the North, but by 1920, over 85% of children 17 and under were enrolled in school. And with so many students in public and private schools across the country, there was a need for thousands of teachers. Although there were more than 760,000 teachers in 1920, there weren't enough for all the students. That year, 25% of students had only a single teacher at their entire school.
All right, Kate. You can stay and write a composition on minding your own business.
Being a teacher initially involved teaching reading, writing, math, and history. By the 1920s, classes in cooking, sewing, and exercise started to be incorporated into curriculums. Even back then, being a teacher was no easy job. Like today, resources for schools were gathered from their localities, but haphazardly so. Segregation amplified the disparity between schools from different regions, resulting in some of the most impoverished rural areas only being able to provide a 3-month-long school year. And compared to public school teachers nowadays, who make an average of $65,000 annually, teachers in 1920 were making less than $2,000 a year, equivalent to roughly $30,000 today. In the early 20th century, the textile industry employed a vast selection of the public, with up to 790,000 people recorded as textile workers in the 1920 census. Although the textile manufacturing industry started in New England, by the 1920s the industry had begun to shift to southern states. Multiple jobs were available in a textile factory, ranging from winding yarn into bobbins, machine assistants, the laundry department, and managing machines. Throughout the 1920s, textile workers faced a variety of problems in the workplace, including dangerous working conditions and health risks. One of the biggest issues was that workers were made to work increasingly more for less pay. Known as the stretch-out, textile workers were required to operate twice as many machines while watching their weekly pay decrease. The textile industry was one of the few places where black women could find employment, but they were typically given the lowest paying positions. Children were frequently employed in textile factories, with some as young as 10 years old, with up to a quarter of all workers under the age of 16 in the early 20th century. The use of child labor within the textile industry wouldn't completely subside until the 1930s. With the rise of industrialization in the United States, factory workers were needed to set up and operate all the new machines. And by 1920, almost 900,000 people were working as machinists, millwrights, and toolmakers. As factory work continued to increase throughout the 20th century, machinists ended up enjoying more job security than other professions. Some people became toolmakers and machinists just to make a living, while others enjoyed working with the machinery. But the amount of training involved was often considered not worth the low pay associated with the job. One worker remarked in 1924 that there are many trades where one does not need to carry an expensive kit of tools and educate themselves to a list of figures and rules, and the compensation is easy double and sometimes triple those of our trade. Consequently, many people who worked as machinists or toolmakers often decided to find another type of job. While the nature of domestic work has changed over the past century, more people are actually employed as servants or domestic workers now than 100 years ago. In 1920, over 1.2 million people held service jobs, ranging from bellhops to nannies and cooks, and that number has almost doubled today. Domestic workers were often in charge of dusting, sweeping, laundry, cooking, dishes, silver polishing, and garden maintenance, among other things. But while in the 19th century most servants lived with their employers, by the 1920s more of them were working during the day rather than living with their employers and being on call at all hours. Because they were mostly prevented from factory work during the 1920s, black people were frequently employed as servants in places like homes, hotels, and railroads. In fact, the Pullman Company's Palace Car had the highest rates of employment of black people in the United States. Domestic positions were all typically exploitative with low pay, yet by the end of the 1920s, over 500,000 black people were working in domestic and professional service, and almost half of all black women were employed as domestic servants. And in places like Atlanta, Georgia, up to 90% of black women were employed in domestic service. As the number of offices and banks increased throughout the beginning of the 20th century, the number of people employed as clerks also grew. In 1920, almost 1.5 million people designated their job title as clerk in the U.S. Census. Initially, clerical work, like most other work, was limited to men, but by the early 1900s, more and more women were able to find employment as clerks. The duties of a clerk included making sales, being responsible for deliveries, and even managing offices. By 1920, being a clerk was the most popular employment possibility for white women, although wages were variable. In Chicago, Illinois, out of roughly 200,000 clerks, half were women, including white women under the age of 24, and many came from immigrant European families. In New York City, many second-generation Italian and Jewish people worked as clerks, but in Louisville, Kentucky, less than 1% of black women were hired as clerks. Retail transformed in the early 20th century with the rise of chain and department stores. These new businesses needed people in order to function, so by 1920, over 3.1 million people worked in stores across America, either as salespersons or retail dealers. The duties of a retail worker, opening and closing stores, restocking shelves, and assisting customers, have changed little over the past 100 years. But at the turn of the 20th century, retail workers also had to deal with incredibly difficult conditions.
I'll take this. Charge it and send. Here's my name and address. 25 cents. My, you are getting off economically, aren't you?
Department store salespeople often worked up to 15 hours every day without being allowed to sit down. Conditions wouldn't improve until the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. But despite the difficulty, many people sought retail jobs for the relative independence the job offered. In Boston, Massachusetts, Prince's School of Salesmanship opened to offer sales training, but the job wasn't accessible to people of all income brackets and was generally only held by middle-class women.
We'll use it as a test to see if we can sell men's drawers to women. And if we can sell them men's anything.
Door-to-door salespeople also became popular in the 1920s. The majority of companies only hired men, although some, like the California Perfume Company, also employed women. No job was more common 100 years ago than working on a farm, with over 10 million people counted in the 1920 census as farm workers, whether it be on a stock or produce farm. The scale of American farming was so vast that up to 30% of people in America lived on a farm, with over 6.4 million farms of varying sizes across the country. But over the following century, the number of farmers in the United States dropped to less than half that. In the 1920s, farm work was especially precarious, with many farmers carrying thousands of dollars of mortgage debt. In Minnesota alone, over half of all farms had mortgage debt that totaled over $250 million. There were over 50,000 farm bankruptcies filed in the 1920s. During this time, there was also over 1 million black farmers, but roughly 90% of the land owned by black farmers was lost when white farmers purchased their debts. And despite the vast debt that white farmers accumulated during this time, they only lost 2% of their land.